Penny Hardaway stepped into the NBA like a rare phenomenon, quickly proving that he was not just a promising talent, but one of the most complete players of his generation. Right from the first seasons with the Orlando Magic, he became the center of the offense with high-level playmaking, scoring, and game-reading abilities, winning the All-Rookie First Team Award and being consecutively selected to the NBA All-Star from 1995 to 1998. Not stopping there, Penny also made the All-NBA First Team twice, an achievement that confirmed his position among the best players in the entire league. In the 1994 to 1995 season, he and Shaquille O'Neal led the Orlando Magic straight into the NBA Finals, a step forward that made the entire league see him as the face of the future. Outside the NBA, he was also a member of the United States team that won gold at the 1996 Olympic Games, where he contributed to one of the strongest lineups in basketball history. Penny's image did not stop at on-court achievements, but spread into popular culture, becoming a Nike icon and tied to iconic advertising campaigns, turning him into one of the most beloved faces in America at that time. Everything, from individual titles to team success, converged to paint the portrait of a legend in the making, a man who seemed destined to dominate the NBA for many years to come. But what no one could prepare for was how all of that gradually left him, not in a violent collapse, but in a prolonged silence through each season. When knee injuries began to steal away what had made him, each movement no longer as fluid, each play losing its natural flow. And the most painful thing was not the physical pain, but realizing that he was no longer himself. Penny still stepped onto the court, still competed, but each game became a reminder that the man who had once made the entire NBA believe in the future had gradually disappeared. And amid that change, he had no other choice but to continue, to keep competing, to keep existing in an incomplete version of himself, carrying memories of what he had once achieved like a burden rather than pride. But it was also precisely in that silence and perseverance that Penny Hardaway's will was shaped, not by victories or titles, but by the fact that he never left the game, even when the game had left him long ago. Before we dive deeper into this story, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to acknowledge a talent that was once destined for greatness. Because what lies ahead is not a journey of victory, but what was taken away little by little from a man who once had it all. After the world once believed that Penny Hardaway would become the future of the NBA, few stopped to ask where such a future had been formed from, because the answer did not lie in brightly lit arenas or stands full of cheers, but began in Memphis, Tennessee, a place where childhood was not measured by carefree innocence, but by the ability to endure. There, he did not grow up with clear dreams or pre-drawn plans, but grew up among streets where each passing day carried a sense of instability, where children learned to observe before learning to trust, and where a small mistake could lead to irreversible consequences. His family was not a solid anchor, as many still think when looking at successful stars, because his father's presence was almost faint, and his mother could not provide a stable rhythm of life, making it so that from very early on, Penny had to teach himself how to exist in a world where no one truly stood to protect him. In that void, his grandmother became everything he could hold on to, not because she could change the circumstances, but because she brought something even more precious, the feeling of being cared for. She was the only person in his life who did not demand that he prove anything, did not place heavy expectations on his shoulders, and did not make him feel he was lacking. But precisely because of that, her presence became more fragile than anything else, because Penny understood that in his life, good things often did not last long, and the fear of losing the only person who brought him peace always silently existed, even though he never said it out loud. The evenings passing in the small house where she was still there could be the rare moments when he felt he did not need to defend himself, did not need to worry about tomorrow. But even then, a part of him was always on guard, as if he had gotten used to preparing for a loss he could not yet name. Penny's childhood did not have memories painted with gentleness, but was a chain of days following one another with the same unanswered question: how to move forward when there was no one to lead the way. He was not taught how to become strong. He was forced to be strong, not by choice, but because circumstances did not allow him to be weak. Other children could rely on family to seek safety, while he had to build that feeling from within, little by little, through silence and endurance. And that very silence gradually became part of who he was, a way to face the world without needing to explain, a way to keep emotions he did not know how to share with anyone. The feeling of not being protected did not only exist in difficult moments, but crept into every thought, every decision, making him always keep an invisible distance from everything around him. Even when standing among others, he still felt he was somewhere outside, as if he did not truly belong anywhere. That isolation was not the result of being abandoned, but the consequence of not having enough trust to connect. Because when you have gotten used to everything possibly disappearing, you stop placing too much hope in anything. That did not make him weak, but made him different. A difference that the world later called composure, but in reality stemmed from a deeper place, where a child had learned to stand on his own before knowing what it was like to be supported. And it was precisely in that context that basketball began to appear, not as a grand dream, but as something enough to keep him away from the paths he knew he did not want to step onto. It did not come to him as a choice, but as a quiet salvation, something that helped him feel he could control at least a small part of this uncertain life. But even when holding the ball in his hands, even when the steps on the court brought a different feeling, Penny still could not escape the person that circumstances had created. A person always preparing for loss, always wary of good things, and always carrying the fear that anything he gained could disappear without warning. Looking back at it all, it can be seen that what happened later in Penny Hardaway's life was not completely unexpected, but a continuation of what had begun very early, from a childhood deprived not only materially, but also of the feeling of safety, from the voids that no one filled, and from a soul that had gotten used to enduring on its own before the world realized how much he had once needed help. And then the thing that Penny Hardaway had always silently feared finally happened. With no warning sign, no way to prepare, just one day, the small world he had tried to hold on to suddenly disappeared when his grandmother, the only person who had ever given him the feeling of safety, passed away, leaving behind not only loss, but a void so deep that he did not know what to fill it with. It was not the ordinary sadness that a child could name, but a prolonged feeling of emptiness, a heavy silence enveloping every thought, when the only person who had ever made him believe he was not completely alone was no longer there. And in that moment, Penny not only lost a loved one, he lost the only place where he had ever felt he could belong. After that passing, everything around him seemed to continue. Memphis was still noisy. The streets were still full of dangerous choices. People still lived the way they always did. But inside him, something had stopped, as if time no longer flowed at the same rhythm. He no longer felt connected to anyone, no longer found reason to believe that everything would be okay, because the best thing in his life had proven the opposite, that the most important things could disappear without explanation. The feeling of not being protected, which had existed before, now became clearer than ever, no longer a vague worry but an undeniable truth. No one would be there forever, and he would have to face everything by himself, whether ready or not. It was in that state that the emptiness began to spread, not in a loud way, but silently, creeping into every thought, every action, making him gradually lose direction. There were days that passed when he did not know what he was trying for. There were moments when everything became meaningless, when there was no one to share with, no one to make him feel he still had value. And in an environment like Memphis, where weakness could be taken advantage of, that state became a real danger, Because when a child has nothing left to hold on to, it is very easy to be swept into anything that appears in front, no matter where that path leads. The temptations around did not need to be too obvious. They only needed to be close enough, accessible enough, and attractive enough to fill the void inside. And in many moments, Penny had stood very close to that line, where just one wrong choice could change his entire life in a direction that could not be turned back. But it was precisely in that fragility that basketball began to become different. No longer simply an activity or a temporary joy, but the only thing left that he could control, the only thing that did not leave him, the only thing that brought a clear feeling amid everything that was fading. Each time he held the ball, each time he ran on the court, it was not just playing, but finding a way to keep himself from slipping, clinging to something solid enough not to be swept away by what was happening around him. Basketball could not replace his grandmother, could not fill the void she left, but it gave him a reason to continue, a direction when everything else was unclear, and gradually it became the only thing he could rely on without fearing that one day it would disappear like everything he had ever had. From that point, Penny Hardaway's life was no longer a journey to find a dream, but a journey to try not to lose himself as he moved forward with a part inside that had permanently changed, carrying the memory of the only person who had ever made him feel safe, and carrying the fear that anything he gained in the future could also leave him in the same way. After losing the only thing that had ever made him feel safe, Penny Hardaway did not step into basketball like a dream, but like a way not to be submerged by what was happening around him, because when everything else became uncontrollable, the ball in his hands was the only thing that responded to his will. The basketball court was the only place he could step into and know that there, at least for a few minutes, he did not need to think about the loss, did not need to face the void his grandmother left, and did not need to worry about the Pabs waiting for him outside the lines. Each run, each shot, was not to impress anyone, but to keep himself from collapsing, to keep his mind from being filled with thoughts he was not ready to face, and precisely because of that, basketball gradually became more than a game. It became the place he hid in, the place where he could exist without needing to explain who he was or what he had lost. But the thing that even he himself did not realize at that time was that his talent was not only enough to help him escape, but also enough to pull him out of everything, because only after a short time, what he showed on the court began to stand out clearly from those around him. His height, arm span, ball handling, and ability to see passes that others did not see made him naturally stand out, without trying, without needing to seek attention. People around him began to talk about him, not as a child with potential, but as someone who could go farther than anyone they had ever seen, and that attention spread from the small neighborhood to the whole city, then beyond Memphis, to people who truly understood basketball. People began to see in him something much bigger than the circumstances he was living in. However, for Penny, that attention did not bring the feeling of pride that many imagined. It carried a pressure he could not name. Because when you grow up in a world where everything can disappear at any time, you do not see opportunity as a reward, but as something you are not allowed to lose. And gradually, basketball was no longer just a place to hide, but became the only path to escape. The only path to ensure that he would not have to return to the place he had tried to leave. And that feeling made each game no longer simply an opportunity to show off, but a test. Once again, to prove that he deserved to move forward. The farther he went, the clearer the fear of returning to his old life became, not as a loud fear, but as a silent pressure always existing behind every decision. Because he understood that if he failed, if he slowed down, if he missed any opportunity, everything could end as quickly as it began, and he would stand again at the starting point, where there was nothing waiting except instability and choices he did not want to face. That left him no room for mistakes, no space to rest, because every step carried the feeling that this was not just an opportunity, but the only opportunity. And precisely because of that, Penny Hardaway's talent did not develop in the ordinary way. It was not nurtured by comfort or pure joy, but was pushed forward by pressure, by fear, by the desire not to return to the place he once belonged to, and that made him progress faster than anyone, but at the same time also made everything more fragile. Because when a person runs not to move forward but to escape what is behind, they will never truly feel safe, no matter how far they go. In those years, no one saw the real battle he was going through. Because on the court, he was only a player becoming more complete, a name being mentioned more, a talent gradually taking shape, but inside, he was still the child who had once lost everything. Still, the person always preparing for the possibility that everything could collapse at any time. And it was precisely the combination of talent and that fear that created the person the world later called Penny Hardaway, a person who did not just play basketball but clung to it as the only way to keep his life from slipping out of control. When basketball gradually became the only thing keeping Penny Hardaway from being swept away by the voids inside, that path also began to open up in a way that even he could not control. And when he stepped into Memphis State, everything was no longer just about existing or escaping, but became a journey where each step carried the weight of the entire past. On the college court, his talent did not just show clearly, but exploded in a way that made observers stop and pay attention. The numbers he produced were not simply statistics, but proof of a player who could do everything: score, assist, defend, control the pace of the game, as if he saw what others could not see. And that made him quickly be mentioned as one of the most complete players at the NCAA level, a name no longer confined to Memphis but beginning to echo farther, to people who had the ability to change his future. But at the same time, the pressure also began to form in a way that no one could see clearly. Because for Penny, success was no longer a choice but a necessity, not because he wanted to be famous, but because he had no right to fail. Because behind every step forward was a fear that always existed. The fear that if he stopped, if he did not continue moving forward, everything he had avoided would wait for him there, intact and unrelenting. That made each game not just an opportunity to perform, but a continuous test, where he had to prove that he deserved to move forward, that he was not just a temporary talent, but a person who could go even farther. The deeper he went into this path, the clearer it became that there were no other turns for him. Because when you have gone far enough to see a future different from your past, turning back is no longer a possibility but something unacceptable. And for Penny, the NBA was no longer a distant dream, but the only escape, the only path that could take him completely away from what he had been through. And that exact thing made the decision to enter the NBA draft not an ambitious choice but an unavoidable step, a step he knew he had to take, whether ready or not. In the moments when it seemed success was opening up before his eyes, another feeling also gradually grew inside him. Not absolute confidence, but a silent pressure, when expectations from outside began to pile on top of the fears inside, when people not only saw him as a good player, but as someone who could change the game, someone destined for great things, and that made him no longer allowed to make mistakes. No space to slow down, because any hesitation could be seen as a sign of failure. The praises, the expectant eyes, the predictions about the future did not bring relief, but created a burden he had to carry every day. Because when the world begins to believe in you, you also begin to fear that you will not be able to become the person they are seeing. And for Penny Hardaway, that fear was not only a personal fear, but also the fear of returning to the place he had tried to leave, the place with no court, no second chance, and no one waiting for him to succeed. Therefore, each step forward he took in this phase was not only the result of talent, but the combination of ability and pressure. Between the desire to move forward and the fear of being pulled back, and that made him one of the most outstanding players, but at the same time also made the road ahead more fragile, because when a person moves forward not just because they want to, but because they have no other choice, then any interruption can create cracks that are not easily mended. When his name began to be mentioned in discussions about the NBA draft, when experts began to talk about him as one of the brightest talents, there was one thing that no one really understood: that for Penny, this was not the peak of a journey, but just another step in the long run he could not stop, a run that he had started long before anyone noticed, and a run that he knew he had to continue, no matter what was waiting ahead. And then the moment that Penny Hardaway had been running toward for all those long years finally arrived, not like an exploding dream, but like a door opening after so many days of being held back, when he stepped into the NBA and put on the uniform of the Orlando Magic, where for the first time in his life, he no longer had to imagine a different future, he was living in it. From the very first games, the difference became clear, not in a flashy way, but in a natural way that made others wonder why everything seemed so easy for him. The way he held the ball, the way he read the situations, the way he made passes that seemed like only he could see, all of it creating a rhythm of its own that the whole team began to revolve around. And in a very short time, the name Penny Hardaway was no longer a rookie, but had become a new center of attention. But what truly changed everything was not just his talent, but the arrival of Shaquille O'Neal, an overwhelming force under the basket. And when these two stood together on the court, it was not simply accommodation, but a promise of something much greater. Shaq brought the power, Penny brought the control, and between them formed a connection that turned the Orlando Magic from an ordinary team into a group that the entire league had to pay attention to. Each game, not just a competition, but a statement that a new power was forming. And people began to talk about them not as a team with potential, but as a team of the future. The way Penny played the game was not like anything the NBA was used to seeing. He was not just fast, not just skilled, but he also had a rare calmness, as if nothing around him could ever make him rush. And that was exactly what made him stand out in a league full of outstanding individuals. He did not need to score a lot of points to prove his value, because every timely pass, every precise decision created an impact that did not need to be spoken. And gradually, not only his teammates but also his opponents began to understand that they were facing a player who could control the game in a way that not many could do. The media began to tell his story in the way they usually did with rising stars. But this time, everything seemed to go beyond the ordinary framework, because they did not just see a good player. They saw an icon forming, someone who could become the face representing the next generation of the NBA. Comparisons began to appear. The name of Magic Johnson was mentioned not as a distant memory, but as a standard that Penny could reach, and in the eyes of many, it was not an exaggeration, but a real possibility, which made his image not only tied to the present, but also to a future that the entire league was waiting for. The promotional campaigns, the commercials, the images appearing everywhere began to build a version of Penny that the world wanted to believe in. A perfect star, a person who had it all: talent, calmness, and a story of rising above circumstances. And in one moment, it seemed as if everything he had lost, all the gaps from the past, were being replaced by the light of the present, as if life was finally giving back to him what he deserved. But even when everything was happening in a way that anyone would call perfect, a part of him still did not fully believe it. Not because he did not appreciate what he had, but because he had become too familiar with the fact that everything could change without warning. And when success came too fast, too complete, it did not only bring joy, but also carried a fragile feeling, as if all of this could disappear at any time, just like the way the most important things in his life had once disappeared before. Still, he kept moving forward because he had no other choice, not only because of the expectations from outside, but also because he himself knew that this was the opportunity he had paid too much to get. And in those years, Penny Hardaway was not just a player who was succeeding. but a person who was trying to hold on to what he had, every game, every moment, as if he was clinging to something that he knew clearly might not exist forever. The success that Penny Hardaway reached in his first years in the NBA did not stop at affirming himself, but quickly surpassed all the limits that a young player usually had. When he and the Orlando Magic went straight to the NBA Finals in 1995, a journey that almost no one had thought of before, especially with a still young team, and throughout that path, Penny was not just a part of the collective, but the soul that controlled everything happening on the court, the one who set the pace, the one who kept everything from going out of control. And when they stepped into the final series of the season, the feeling was no longer hope, but the belief that this was the beginning of a new dynasty, a period where the name Penny Hardaway would be mentioned as the center of every story. In a very short period of time, he was no longer a young player learning, but had become an all-star, a face representing the new generation of the NBA, where talent was not only judged by points, but by the ability to influence the entire game. And Penny did that so naturally that people forgot he was still very young. His appearances at the All-Star game were not just recognition, but a sign that he had stepped into another level, where the biggest names in the league existed. And what was worth noting was that he not only stood with them, but gradually came to be seen as one of them. Someone who did not need to wait for the future, because the future seemed to have arrived earlier than expected. The comparisons began to become denser, and the name Magic Johnson was no longer mentioned as an untouchable icon, but as a model that Penny could continue, someone who could bring the combination of height, skill, and vision that the league had witnessed before. And for many people, this was not a comparison of expectation, but a grounded observation, because what Penny showed not only fit that standard, but also made people believe he could go even further. This made his image not only tied to the present, but to a future that the entire NBA was waiting for. A future where he was placed in the center position, even though he had never asked for it. But that very recognition also brought something else that not everyone noticed right away, which was the weight of expectation. When the entire league began to look at one person and believe that he would become something much greater than the present. When each game was no longer just a part of the season, but became a step forward or a step backward in the story they had already written for him. Penny was not only playing for himself, but gradually became the one carrying the predictions, the hopes, the visions that others had drawn, and that began to change the way he saw himself, not in the direction of arrogance, but in a more cautious direction. When he understood that he was no longer allowed to simply play ball, but had to maintain a standard that everyone had placed on him. Even though success continued, even though the game still brought moments that made the audience stand up, something else was also quietly forming inside him. A pressure that did not come from a specific failure, but from having to maintain everything he had achieved, from not being allowed to decline, not being allowed to stall, and more importantly, not being allowed to become a lesser version of himself. That made every step heavier, not because he no longer had the ability, but because he understood that the higher you climb, the greater the distance to fall, and when you have been placed in the position of a future, not becoming that future would no longer be a slowdown, but would be seen as a loss. In those years, Penny Hardaway was not only living in the spotlight, but living in a story that everyone had already written for him, a story in which he was expected to complete it in the way they believed was right. And even though he continued to play, continued to shine, continued to prove that he deserved all the attention, that pressure did not disappear. It only grew bigger, day by day, game by game, until it became an inseparable part of who he was, a part that later, when everything began to change, would become the thing that made what he lost much more painful. But then, amid everything that seemed to be moving forward on an unstoppable trajectory, the thing that Penny Hardaway had never really prepared to face finally began to appear, not like a sudden collapse, but like a small signal, almost unnoticeable in the early days when his knee began to hurt. Not a pain that forced him to stop immediately, but something lingering, persistent, enough for him to realize that something was no longer right as before, but not enough for him to accept that it could change everything. In a world where he had become used to having to continue no matter what happened, giving up had never been an option. And therefore, he still went out on the court, still played, still tried to keep the familiar rhythm, as if as long as he did not stop, everything would return to its right place on its own. But the body does not work the way the will wants, and gradually, the pain was no longer just a passing feeling, but became a part of every movement, every jump, every change of direction, and what used to be instinct now began to demand effort, demand focus, demand an adjustment that he had never had to think about before. The doctors began to give diagnoses, advice, and finally decisions. He did not want to hear: surgery, time off, accepting that something in his body had changed in a way that could not be completely reversed. The surgeries were not just physical interventions, but periods when he was forced to stop, forced to sit out and watch everything continue without him. And for someone who had built his entire life on not stopping, that was a challenge. There was no way to prepare for. Each day passing during recovery was not like the games. There was no audience, no cheers, only silence, repeated exercises, and a question that was always present: whether he could return as before or not. And then, when he really returned to the court, the moment that should have been a rebirth instead carried a different feeling. A feeling hard to name when he realized that he was still there, still playing. But something had changed. Not in the way he thought, but in the way his body responded. The runs were no longer as smooth as before. The jumps lacked some of the height. The bursts of speed no longer created the gap like in the old days. And the most painful thing was not that difference, but the fact that he recognized it immediately, recognized that the best version of himself might no longer exist. The following games became a series of moments that he had never had to face before, when he started to be a step slower, when opponents could catch up to what used to be his advantage, when decisions had to be made faster to compensate for what his body could no longer do. And even though he still had shining moments, still had plays that made the audience remember who he once was, those moments no longer came regularly, but became scattered, not enough to keep the image that people were familiar with. The signs of decline did not come all at once, but appeared little by little, making acceptance even harder, because there was always a part of him that believed he could still come back, that with just more time, more effort, everything would return to the way it was. But each game that passed brought a different truth, a truth that he could not ignore forever: that his body was no longer the absolute ally as before, but had become something unpredictable, something that could betray him at any time. For a person whose life had been tied to control, to relying on himself to overcome everything, not being able to trust his own body was an experience that could not be fully described, because it not only took away the ability to play, but also took away the sense of certainty, took away the belief that if he tried hard enough, he would achieve what he wanted. Now he still tried, even more than before, but the results were no longer matching, and that created a gap between effort and reality that he could not close. And then there was a moment, not on the scoreboard, not in a specific game, but somewhere between the times on the court and the training sessions, when Penny Hardaway began to understand that this was not a temporary phase, not a challenge he could overcome to come back stronger, but a permanent change, a new limit that he was forced to accept, whether he wanted to or not. It was not a moment that the world recognized, because on the outside he was still playing, still appearing, still part of the game, but inside, something had ended. Not loudly, not dramatically, just simply no longer as before. And perhaps that was the deepest tragedy in his life. Not being defeated by opponents, not a clear failure, but being betrayed by his own body, in a slow, unavoidable, and irreparable way, when he had to continue moving forward with a version of himself that he knew clearly would never be the same again. After the moment when his own body no longer stood on his side, Penny Hardaway did not leave the court, did not disappear from the NBA in the way people usually remember, but he continued to appear, continued to play, continued to hold his position in the quietest way. And that was exactly what made everything harder to notice, because there was no single day when it all ended. There was no game that was called the last of the best version. There were only games passing with small differences, differences that at first only he felt clearly, while the outside world still saw a familiar name and believed everything was still the same. His form did not disappear in one moment, but declined gradually in a way that was almost impossible to measure, when what used to be advantages became less effective, when speed was no longer enough to create gaps, when the handling no longer made opponents lose balance like before, and each game became a very small step back, small to the point that no one rushed to notice, but enough to create a trend that over time could not be denied. He still had shining moments, still had plays that made people remember who he once was, but those moments became rarer and rarer, no longer enough to define the entire game, and gradually they became memories more than the present. Inside the team, changes also began to happen, not through sudden decisions, but through small adjustments, when his role was no longer the absolute center, when the attacks no longer always started from his hands, when responsibilities were gradually shared with others. And even though no one said it clearly, that change was still present in every tactic, every minute of play, every decision of the coach. For someone who had once controlled the pace of the entire game, becoming a part of a system instead of its center was not just a change in position, but a change in the way he existed on the court. At the same time, the media's attention also began to shift, not because they forgot him immediately, but because there were always new stories appearing, new faces rising, new talents bringing the fresh feeling that the public always sought. The articles, the analyses, the discussions gradually no longer revolved around him as before, no longer placed him at the center of the NBA's future, but moved to other names, those who were in the stage he had once been through, and that did not happen in one day, but was a long process, enough to make the change seem normal in everyone's eyes, but deep enough for him to feel clearly step by step. What made it all painful was not losing the spotlight, but the way it happened, slowly, almost unnoticed, as if the world did not really realize that they were losing something that had once been very important, and that very silence made Penny Hardaway's decline different from other stories, because he was not defeated in a decisive game, not removed from the game in a dramatic moment, but simply left behind as the game continued forward without needing him anymore. As each day passed, as each season ended, the gap between the person he once was and the person he was becoming clearer and clearer, not only in the eyes of others, but in his own thoughts, when he began to look back at what he had done and realized that those things seemed to belong to someone else, a version he could no longer reach. He still played, still tried, still found ways to adapt to what his body allowed, but that effort no longer led to the same results. And that created a feeling that was not easy to describe. When you know you are still trying your best, but the world no longer responds the way it once did. The loss in this period was not something specific that he could point out, but the total of many things that were gradually disappearing, from position, role, recognition, to the sense of control he once had. And because it happened gradually, he did not have the chance to face it in one single moment, but had to live with it, day by day, game by game, small decision by small decision, until he realized that he was no longer standing in the position he once thought would belong to him for many years to come. And, perhaps, that was exactly what made this part of the story heavier than anything else. Not because of what had happened, but because of the way it happened. When Penny Hardaway never had a clear moment to say goodbye to the best version of himself, there was no clear line to step over and accept that everything had ended. but only a long journey where he gradually moved away from himself without the chance to come back, until it became the truth that he could not deny, even though he had never been ready to accept it. When everything could no longer return to the way it was before, Penny Hardaway still did not leave the court, did not choose to disappear completely, but continued to walk in a journey that even he understood would never be like what had passed. And then he left the place that had once been tied to his brightest years to begin a new chapter with the Phoenix Suns, where he was no longer the symbol of the future, no longer the center of every plan, but became a part of a collective that already had its own structure, a link that needed to adapt more than to lead. The early days there did not bring a feeling of rebirth as many people might think, but a quiet transition when he had to learn how to play basketball in a different role, a role that he had never imagined he would have to accept when he was at his peak. He still went out on the court, still played with the focus and experience accumulated from the years before, but the difference between the past and the present could not be hidden, not because he no longer understood the game, but because his body no longer allowed him to execute what he saw in his head, and that made everything slower, heavier. When every decision had to be calculated more, every handling had to be adjusted to fit the new limits. The moments when he once completely dominated now became situations where he had to find ways to adapt, and even though he still had important contributions, they no longer brought the overwhelming feeling like before, no longer made the game revolve around him, but only helped him keep his place in a larger system. After Phoenix, the journey continued to take him to the New York Knicks, a different environment, a different city. But the feeling inside did not change. When he continued to exist in the NBA as a familiar name, a person who could still play, could still appear in the lineup, but was no longer the reason for people to follow a game, no longer the center of the stories that the media wanted to tell. The games took place, the seasons passed, and he was still there, still wearing the uniform, still stepping onto the court, but there was an invisible gap between his presence and the influence he once created, a gap that could not be closed by effort alone. That difference did not only lie in the statistics or the tactical role, but in the feeling, when he realized that what he was doing no longer carried the same meaning as before, when each game was no longer a step forward in the journey of conquest, but became a part of continuation, a maintenance more than a development. He still loved basketball, still understood the value of playing at the highest level, but the feeling that once made him cling to it like an escape was no longer as strong as before, because now it no longer took him further, but only kept him in a position that he was not sure he truly belonged to. The feeling of being left behind did not come from being removed from the game, but from the game continuing without revolving around him anymore. When new faces appeared, new talents were praised, new stories were told, and he gradually became a part of the past that people only mentioned when they needed to compare or when remembering what had once happened. That did not happen in a cruel way. No one openly said that he was no longer important, but that silence carried its own weight. When he saw clearly that the position he once occupied was now filled by others, and there was no sign that it would return to him. Still, he continued, not because he believed he would return to the way he was, but because it was the only thing he knew how to do, the only thing that had defined him throughout those long years, and giving it up was not an easy decision, especially when he had gone too far to turn back. But that very continuation also carried a quiet pain, when every step reminded him of what had been lost, when every game became a comparison between the person he once was and the person he was becoming, and the gap between the two grew larger and larger. Not because he stopped trying, but because time and what had happened did not allow him to close it. Penny Hardaway's career in this period did not end, did not stop in a clear way, but continued in a way that people could easily overlook, as if he was still there, so nothing had really changed. But for him personally, everything had been different for a very long time. when the meaning of playing no longer tied to the future he once aimed for, but only remained as a part of the present that he had to learn to accept. And perhaps that was the hardest thing, not losing the position, but continuing to live with a journey that was still happening, but no longer brought the feeling he had pursued from the very first days. And when the journey continued but no longer carried the meaning as before, Penny Hardaway began to face something that no opponent on the court could cause: his own memories. When what he once was did not disappear but still existed clearly in his mind, every play, every run, every moment when he could control the entire game like an instinct, all of it still there, intact, as if it had never changed, and that very thing made the reality harder to accept. Because he was not someone who had never reached the peak. He was someone who had once stood there, had once touched the most perfect version of himself, and now had to live in a body that no longer allowed him to go back. Those memories did not come as comfort, but as a non-stop comparison. When every time he stepped onto the court, every time he touched the ball, he knew clearly what he had once been able to do. What he had once been able to do faster, stronger, more precisely, and the gap between those two versions was not only physical, but in the feeling. When he realized that what had made him who he was no longer existed in the same way. That made playing no longer a natural action, but became a process that required thinking, adjusting, accepting that he could no longer rely on instinct like before. And for a person who had once lived by that instinct, this was a change not easy to accept. The biggest difficulty was not that others saw him differently, but that he saw himself differently. When he no longer recognized the person he had once been familiar with, when the things that once defined him now only existed in the past, and accepting that did not happen in one clear moment, but was a long process, where he had to face, step by step, the truth that he was no longer the player everyone once expected, and more importantly, no longer the player he himself once believed he would always be. The feeling of losing himself did not come from losing fame or position, but from losing the connection with his own self. When he no longer knew which was the real version of himself, was it the person who had once dominated the court, or the person trying to exist in a different role? Questions began to appear, not to find immediate answers, but as a part of the internal struggle, when he asked himself who he was, if not the player he had become, where his value lay if what once made him different was no longer present, and whether what he had achieved was enough to define him for the rest of his life or not. In those moments, the present was no longer a place where he felt comfortable, because it always reminded him of what had changed, and therefore he began to live more in memories, where everything was still intact, where he was still the one who could master the game, where the runs were not limited by anything. Memories became another refuge, like the way basketball had once been a place he escaped into when he was a child, but this time it did not take him forward, but kept him at a point he knew clearly he could not return to. And that created a feeling both familiar and painful, when he realized that the only thing he could hold on to was something that no longer existed in reality. Still, he continued, not because he had found answers to all those questions, but because he had no other choice. Because life did not stop just because a part of you had changed, and he was forced to learn how to live with it, how to exist with a version of himself he had never imagined, how to accept that there were things that could not be taken back, no matter how hard he tried. And in that process, Penny Hardaway did not become a different person, but became a person carrying two versions of himself. One version that had once existed, and one version trying to continue, coexisting in the same life, but never completely merging into one. While Penny Hardaway was still trying to exist between two versions of himself, the outside world did not stop to wait for him to find the answers. The NBA continued to move forward at a speed no one could control. New seasons began, new names appeared, new stories were told, And gradually, the focus of the league no longer revolved around what he had once represented, but shifted to faces that brought a fresh feeling. Young talents with energy and physicality not yet worn down. People who were standing exactly where he once stood. And that happened so naturally that no one felt the need to explain. Because in sports change is always inevitable, it was just that for Penny, he was no longer at the center of that change anymore. His name did not disappear completely. It still existed, still mentioned in conversations, but the way it was mentioned had changed, no longer the present, no longer the future, but became a part of the past. A name used to compare, to recall, to retell what had once happened, and that created an invisible gap between the person he was living as and the image the world still held on to. There were moments when he realized that when people talked about Penny Hardaway, they were not really talking about his present self, but about a version that had stopped somewhere in their memories. A version he could no longer return to, even though he was still there, still continuing his life. The spotlight that once surrounded him did not disappear in one moment, but gave way to silence. A silence not loud, but clear enough to feel, when the cameras no longer sought him out like before, when the questions no longer revolved around him, when the big stories of the NBA no longer needed his presence to be complete. That silence was not denial, but a gentle form of forgetting, where no one actively removed him, but no one kept him in the position he once had. And that very thing made everything harder to accept, because there was nothing to resist, nothing to change, only a reality he had to face every day. His life also gradually separated from the big stage he once belonged to. No longer the moments when the whole world followed every run, no longer the nights when every play could change the way people saw him, but instead days passing with a calmer rhythm, where basketball still existed but was no longer the only center, where he had to learn to live without fully relying on the lights, and that was not an easy transition, because when you have gotten used to being seen, returning to normal is not just a change in circumstances, but a change in how you perceive your own value. The feeling of being forgotten did not come as a shock, but appeared slowly, creeping through small details when he realized that his games were no longer mentioned as much, when those who once followed him now directed their attention to other names, when memories of him were gradually replaced by new moments the world was creating. That did not make him disappear, but made him feel like he was standing outside a story where he had once been the main character, looking in but no longer able to influence it the way he once had. And in all of that, Penny Hardaway still continued, not because he did not recognize what was happening, but because he did not know how to stop, because his life had never been built on giving up, but always on stepping forward, even when the path ahead was no longer as clear as before. But that very continuation also carried its own loneliness, when he had to find meaning again by himself in a world that had changed, when he had to accept that there were phases in life when you are no longer the center, even though you once were, and there was no way to go back except learning to live with it. Perhaps the hardest thing was not that the world had moved on, but that he had to do the same, when everything outside no longer reflected the person he once was, when what he once relied on to define himself no longer existed in the same way, and he had to find another way to exist, not as a star, but as a person trying to understand that his value did not only lie in what had been lost, but also in how he continued to live without those things. And that was a journey with no audience, no applause, only silence and questions he had to answer for himself, one day at a time. And then, after everything that had passed, when the world no longer placed him at the center of the story, Penny Hardaway made a decision that few people could fully understand the meaning of. He returned to Memphis, not as a star returning in glory, but as a person returning to the place that had once left the deepest wounds in his life, where everything had begun, where he had once been a child with nothing but gaps. And that return did not bring a feeling of victory, but carried a confrontation when he had to step again on the familiar streets, look back at what had once shaped him, but this time not as someone trying to escape, but as someone who had gone through it and was trying to understand it all again. Memphis did not change just because he returned. The streets were still the same. The stories continued. The children still grew up in circumstances he understood too well, and it was in those faces that he began to see himself from many years ago again, not through vague memories, but through the eyes, the gestures, the ways they stood in a world not sure where they belonged. That made coaching not just a job, but a personal journey, when every practice, every instruction was not only about basketball, but about how to make sure they did not have to go through what he had gone through, how they could find a clearer path, a support that he had once lacked. When standing in front of the young players, he did not see them as talents needing development, but as people standing at a crossroads just like he once had, and that made the way he worked different, not stopping at technique or tactics, but the way he tried to pass on something deeper to them, and understanding that basketball was not just a game, but could be a path, an opportunity, a way to change life if they knew how to seize it properly. But at the same time, he also understood that not everyone would reach where they wanted, and that was why he not only taught them how to win, but taught them how to stand firm when everything did not go as planned. In those moments, Penny Hardaway was no longer the person trying to find himself in the past, but the person seeing that past come alive in others, and that brought a feeling both familiar and painful. When he realized that what he had gone through was not unique, that there were still children starting from the same point, carrying similar fears, similar gaps, and that very thing made him unable to stand aside, unable to just watch without doing anything. Because if he could change even a small part in their journey, then what he had gone through would not be completely meaningless. Helping others did not erase his losses, did not take him back to the time when everything was intact, but it brought a different kind of meaning, something that did not depend on whether he could play basketball like before or not, but on what influence he could create in the lives of others. Every word, every guidance, every moment he saw them progress was not only their achievement, but also a part of the journey he was continuing, a journey no longer revolving around becoming someone, but helping others become the best version of themselves. Gradually, in that giving, something began to change inside him. Not forgetting the past, but the way he perceived it, when what once only brought a feeling of loss now began to carry a different meaning, as if everything he had gone through, no matter how painful, had prepared him for a role he had never thought of. And even though he could never go back to complete his own story the way the world once expected, he could still become a part of other people's stories, in a way that did not need lights, did not need recognition, but was still deep enough to make a difference. Perhaps that was the first time, after so many years, that Penny Hardaway felt he no longer needed to run, no longer needed to prove anything, no longer needed to compare with his old self, because his value no longer lay in what he had once done on the court, but in what he was doing off the court. And in the silence of Memphis, where everything had once begun with pain, he began to find a different kind of peace, not perfection, but acceptance, when he understood that even though his life had not gone the way he once thought, it could still bring meaning, in a way he had never imagined. When everything gradually calmed down and life was no longer swept along by the rhythm of games or expectations from outside, the question about legacy began to appear in a way that Penny Hardaway could not avoid. Not because he wanted to look back at the past, but because that past always existed, always got mentioned, but was never completed in the way the world once believed. He did not reach the legendary status in the sense that people usually defined. There were no long streaks of titles, no milestones that placed his name alongside the greatest ones, and that was not because he lacked talent, but because his journey had been changed in a way that no one could control, leaving a feeling that his story had stopped before it truly reached the point it was written for from the beginning. So when people mentioned him, they did not only talk about what he had done, but also about what he could have become, a combination of reality and assumption that few players carried throughout their entire lives. He was remembered as an unfulfilled talent, not because he had not achieved anything, but because what he achieved was only a part of what he could have achieved. And that very gap created a special kind of legacy, when his name always came with the question, "What if?" A question that never had an answer but was always strong enough to keep him in a unique position in NBA history. Even though he did not touch the final peak, Penny Hardaway's influence did not disappear. It existed in more subtle ways, weaving into how modern basketball developed, when players with his height and ball-handling skills became a model, when the role of a player who could both score and orchestrate became more common, and even though his name was not always mentioned when talking about that change, his mark was still present, like a part of the process the NBA had gone through. He did not need to be at the center of every discussion to have influence, because what he had shown on the court was enough to become a reference, a standard that those who came after could learn from, whether they realized it or not. His story also became an example that people mentioned not to praise a perfect victory, but to understand more clearly how potential might not reach where it was expected, how a journey could change even when everything at first seemed already arranged. In a world where success is often measured by the final result, Penny's story brought a different perspective, when it showed that there were people who did not fail in the usual way, but also did not reach the destination they were destined for, and they had to live the rest of their lives with that truth, not as a burden, but as an inseparable part of themselves. But if the legacy only stopped at what had not happened, it would not be complete, and it was precisely what he did after leaving the peak that was the part few people saw, but carried the deepest meaning. When Penny Hardaway chose to return, chose to stay, chose to dedicate his time and energy to others, not to find the past again, but to create a future he did not have the chance to complete. The young players he coached, the people he helped, all became a part of that legacy, not in the form of titles or records, but in the form of influence. An influence not easy to measure, but enough to create change in the lives of those he touched. Perhaps his legacy would never be mentioned in the way the greatest legends were mentioned, but it existed in a different way. Not loud, not complete, but real. When it included both what he had achieved and what he had lost, both the brilliant moments and the long gaps, and that very combination made his story closer, easier to feel, because it reflected a truth that not everyone wanted to face. That life does not always go in the direction we want. And the value of a person lies not only in what they achieve, but also in how they continue to live when that does not happen. And perhaps that was exactly what Penny Hardaway left behind. Not a perfect legacy, but a legacy carrying incompleteness. A story not completed, but still continuing to exist, not on the record books, but in the way it made others think, feel, and rethink the meaning of success, failure, and everything that lies between the two. When looking back at Penny Hardaway's entire journey, from a child growing up amid the gaps in Memphis to a name that the entire NBA once placed expectations on, then gradually stepping out of the spotlight without a clear farewell moment, people could not tell his story in a simple way, like win or lose, success or failure, because his life did not follow a straight line, but a series of advances and losses intertwined, where each phase carried its own meaning, but no phase was truly complete. He had everything needed to become one of the greatest legends, had touched peaks that many could only dream of. But he himself understood most clearly that that journey had stopped before reaching the point it was expected to, not because he lacked effort, but because there were things beyond anyone's control. His childhood did not give him a solid foundation, but forced him to build himself from what was missing. The early loss made him understand the feeling of having no support, and that very thing pushed him toward basketball as a way to exist, to find a direction when everything else was unclear. From there, he stepped into a journey where every advance carried the pressure to escape the past, to become a different version of himself. And when the opportunity came, he not only seized it, but turned it into reality in a way that the whole world had to pay attention to, bringing himself to a position that very few could reach in such a short time. But precisely when everything seemed arranged in a perfect direction, when his future was no longer a question but almost a certainty, his body began to change, not in a way he could fix with will or effort, but in a way that forced him to accept that there were limits he could not overcome, no matter how much he wanted. From then on, his journey was no longer about moving forward, but about trying to hold on to what was gradually leaving, a long process, not loud, but deep enough to change the entire path he had taken. Those losses did not disappear when he left the peak. They stayed, existing parallel to his life, not as a wound that always hurt, but as a part of who he was, a part he could not separate, no matter how much time passed. He still lived, still continued, still found other ways to create meaning. But what had happened never really left. It only changed the way he saw life, the way he understood himself, and what truly mattered. And perhaps the most notable thing was not in what he had lost, but in the fact that he never stopped, never let those things become a reason to give up. Even though the road ahead no longer resembled what he had once imagined, even though his story did not reach the ending everyone had written, he still continued to move forward, not to complete something, but simply to keep living with everything he had been through. He did not try to go back to become the old person, but learned to exist with the current person, carrying both what was complete and what was unfinished. There are stories that end in victory. There are stories that end in failure. But Penny Hardaway's story did not really end because it had no clear stopping point, no moment when everything was closed and defined decisively. It continued in the way life always continues, with things unfinished, with questions without answers, with possibilities that never became reality, and that very thing made it different. When it was not only the story of a player, but the story of a person who had lived through all of that and still chose to keep going. And in the end, perhaps what this story left behind was not a clear conclusion, but a feeling, a realization that not every journey reaches the destination we want. But that does not mean they have no value, because sometimes the value lies in the continuing itself, in not stopping, in still moving forward, even knowing that one's story may never be completed the way one once thought. And in that, Penny Hardaway was not only a name in NBA history, but a proof that humans can continue to live, continue to exist, even when they never get the chance to finish writing their own story. Penny Hardaway's story not only evokes regret, but also makes people feel a very quiet, very deep sadness, because he did not fail in the way the world usually understands. He did everything right, overcoming a deprived childhood in Memphis, turning basketball into the only path to escape, rising to become an all-star, taking the Orlando Magic to the NBA Finals in 1995 and being compared to Magic Johnson. But then everything was taken away not by mistake, but by knee injuries, which quietly eroded every run, every burst of speed, until he was still there but no longer himself. The most painful part was that the decline did not have a clear moment, but happened gradually, when the media gradually shifted to new faces, when he had to accept smaller roles with the Phoenix Suns and then the New York Knicks, and when he began to live more in memories of his best version. But right in that silence, he chose a path worth respecting, returning to Memphis, working with children in similar circumstances, turning personal losses into value for others. With American society, where success is often measured by titles and peaks, this story reminds us that a person's value does not lie in whether you achieved everything or not, but in how you continue to live when you do not. That there are dreams that are never completed, but that does not make life meaningless. Because as Penny has shown, meaning sometimes lies in standing up, continuing to move forward, and using precisely what you have lost to help others not have to lose the same way. If Penny Hardaway's story makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to appreciate a journey that was never completed fully. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video where we continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone sees.